Welcome to the Security Tapes, and today we are joined by Matthew K from Shawbrook. And Matthew's going to bring a slightly different angle because his past is not pure security. We are looking more at sort of data privacy today, which obviously, as we know, all these areas cross over. So, yeah, straight over to you, really, Matthew. Would you like to give us an introduction to yourself? Let us know why you're with us today. How have you ended up on our podcast?
You then. And thank you for the introduction to join the podcast. It's a pleasure to be part of it. I guess like anything as networks and paths cross, I'm invited from time to time to do these types of events, and it's great to sort of step away from the day job and sort of advocate best practice in industry. So yeah, looking forward to getting stuck into that.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Adza, would you like to take us into the questioning?
Yes. In terms of your background, you're really a sort of a privacy and risk and compliance guy rather than the hardcore technical side of things. And you've got a background in ICO, if I remember correctly, which I think everyone in the UK in cybersecurity is going to be familiar with, which is quite a sort of a unique background. Can you sort of talk a little bit about sort of how that's shaped your understanding of security and your route through the industry?
Yeah, so I've worked in data privacy for over 12 years now. And as you referenced, I started my career with the UK regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office. And then following sort of 3 years with the ICO, I've subsequently worked in a variety of different sectors. And most recently now in financial services, first with Metro Bank and now with Shawbrook. And I think starting out, the ICO gave me sort of a great grounding in terms of model of best practice for data privacy. So I started off by advising organizations across the board on data privacy. And then I moved into their audit department. So I used to lead teams auditing different sectors and making recommendations as to how they sort of can improve their data privacy practice. So I've seen model of best practice, middle of the road, and sort of worst case scenario. And I guess that sort of 3 year grounding set me up well to move over to the other side of the fence. After that, I joined as the DPO of a London borough, and then I've spent the last few years, as alluded to, in industry. So I think from sort of seeing how things need to be done and what the regulator expects, that the latter part of my career has been spent leading functions and making sure we execute a robust data privacy function. And I guess just finally, when you talk about, I guess, sort of the differentiation between security and data privacy, there's naturally a close overlap, but you often find in organizations, they'll have a DPO to look after the data privacy aspects, and then your CISO, so your chief information security officer, to oversee sort of the pure security aspects. But what you find is because of like the close overlap between information security and data privacy, there's that kind of close interaction and engagement. So I guess the way I kind of set it out is information security is a small part of data privacy because there's a lot of other aspects to it, and vice versa. Data privacy is a small part of information security because it's focused on personal data, but you have to think about the broader security protections for data as a whole within an organization.
That makes sense. And I feel like it's one of those things that unless you're in that sort of risk and data protection world, you might not have had a huge amount of exposure to it, and people might not be super familiar with what data protection as a practice really entails.
Yeah, and I think it's like a particular mindset as well. Like, I guess sort of my time at the ICO and the nature of the work I've done, my mind is very much positioned as to what if, what could happen, what are the risks, and then I guess subsequently how you secure those risks. Often my close interaction with the CISO will be examining projects, looking at areas from a data privacy perspective that pose high risk to people's personal data, and then what security mechanisms we can put in place in order to protect the information, whether it be firewalls in terms of access and prevention from sort of public attacks, or sending information out from sort of an encryption perspective.
When you were talking about the ICO, tantalizingly, you talked about the sort of the worst case scenarios. And I know you can't talk about specifics, and it's all wrapped behind layers of confidentiality. But I would be interested in understanding a bit about what really, really good practice looks like and what absolute, complete, upside down, on fire in a bin looks like.
Yeah, so I think, a lot of the challenges and where a lot of organizations fall down, and I don't just think about this based on data privacy. I think it's management as a whole. I see everything as sort of succeeding and falling apart based on good and bad governance. So what does that look like in the food chain from top to bottom, from the CEO right down to the operational aspects at a very junior level? And I think what you can often see in organizations is pockets of good practice, but then the challenge could be how does that hang together effectively? So how do you get the organization pulling in the same direction and ensuring the sort of right kind of reporting is happening, so the right kind of visibility right at the top table, right up to the exco, to the board? How are they getting visibility and assurance that the risks associated with data privacy or broader risk and compliance challenges, how are they getting reviewed, scrutinized, and approved? And I think often you can see certain areas doing a good job, but other areas not necessarily following in the same patterns. I think the key in the art is to kind of make sure across the board as much as possible is kind of a consistent approach. And I think that's where the sort of DPO, plays a really key role, because, they often report to that highest level of management. I report directly into the exco. I go and give annual assurance to the board, but I've kind of got to survey the landscape in terms of the business and what I expect at, an operational level. I need to see what's happening and then get comfortable with those kind of processes and challenge and scrutinize where I'm not happy.
Right.
Do you know, Matt, with it's funny to talk about this kind of governance and things. I mean, I feel like this is still a relatively mature industry, the security side of things. And I think back to how we've sort of improved stuff over time, and frameworks and regulations have definitely played a part in my existence in the sector, and bringing it to really sort of DPO and bringing it to privacy. I remember when GDPR came out, and I remember, obviously, I mean, GDPR were everywhere. It was even on the Weetabix box, I think, at one point, but a big push about it. But then once it became you have to comply, it seemed to kind of go a little bit quiet in that, were people really compliant? Were they doing the things they needed to do? And then the fines started coming. And I remember some of the first fines, kind of chunky, kind of grabbed people's attention. And I suppose I'm seeing a parallel now, because DORA, which is very much an EU regulation, but if you're a financial company trading in certain ways with the EU, indeed not a financial company trading with the EU in certain ways, from a security perspective, around supply chain, and definitely it's in its name, resilience, that there's going to be some big changes. And I just wonder if we're going to follow a similar pattern to what we did with GDPR, which is people are aware of it, they know about it, they've talked about it. Sales are certainly aware of it, because that's on the Weetabix as well now. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, how do you see sort of frameworks and regulation pushing good practice based on what you said?
Yeah, so I think for me, I'm really supportive of sort of a framework and a principle-led approach, because I think when you're trying to govern and navigate different legislation, there's often overlap, but there's often subtle differences as well. And I think if you're leading a global function, I mean, from my point of view, Shawbrook is primarily UK based, but we obviously, contract with global organisation and part of our process and procedure. And I have worked in more global roles as well, where I've sat under CPO and looked after a particular region like EMEA. And I think what you have to do in those scenarios is kind of not one size fits all, but you've got to find consistencies to sort of achieve core compliance. And that's where, if you look at the UK GDPR, you've kind of got those principles that kind of set out what expectations there is. ISO from an information security perspective, DORA, as you're speaking to at the moment. A lot of the kind of common principles and expectations are similar. So it's finding how you get comfortable, and if there is a degree of conflict, how do you reach that sort of common goal to achieve the outcome you want? I think what you were speaking to earlier in terms of when GDPR come in, and that sort of really focused the minds. I mean, as he alluded to, worked in data privacy a lot longer than GDPR. The ICO existed a long time before that came into play. Previously we had the DPA 1998. I guess maybe what wasn't anticipated is obviously the different regulators will still interpret that legislation in a different way. And then, we've stepped away further in terms of the UK as in exiting the EU, even though we've implemented the UK GDPR, but we've had the DORA coming recently as well, which will introduce some sort of changes and nuances. So I think when that legislation came in, the real kind of focus, I guess, was the sort of increase in fines, because under the DPA, you could get fined up to $500,000, and obviously now the fines are a lot more significant, and that's why it's really focused the minds of organisations. But I thought what was interesting when I sat on sort of different panel events, gave different keynotes at the time, and what I was trying to emphasize to organizations is everyone was focused on that date of the 25th of May 2018, but it was about sort of saying, it's not about, you kind of submit your assurance report and then you tick it off after that deadline. You submit your exam paper, that's marked, and off you go, you get your grade. It was about thinking about the longer term strategy, that once that legislation's in play, that increased focus in terms of detriment to organisations when reputation, fine, etc. exists and still exists today. So I think that's what's seen organisations really have to up the ante. And then I guess as you were speaking to, in terms of DORA, obviously an increased focus on supply chain and management of third parties, that has a lot to do with, your sort of data processors rather than your data controller can be held accountable under the UK GDPR, and the data controllers themselves can be held accountable for a breach by third parties. Managing that supply chain from start to finish is really critical, and I think often the critical point is that if you yourself as a big multinational, you hope you have a good level of infrastructure in place, but as you have to contract out services, you're dealing with a lot smaller organizations and they may not have the same level of infrastructure and support. So it's making sure they're appropriately supported, and you also have the appropriate contractual provisions in place to hold them to it.
So here's a question around the sort of the more regulatory side of things with GDPR and DORA. Do you think it's helped? I know it's a slightly incendiary question, and it's very much the world we live in. But from your experience, particularly with the ICO in different sectors as well, do you feel like it helps, or do you think it's just another hoop that people need to jump through?
So I think undoubtedly the GDPR has helped, because now it's a key level of focus for organisations in terms of privacy compliance. So the focus on governance and management of personal data will undoubtedly help that for protection of individuals. DPOs have got a lot more levers to sort of push on now than they had under the previous regime. And DORA is obviously relatively new in existence, and I think you will see similar themes to what is asked in respect to the UK GDPR, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out. But I think legislation for a governance professional is always a positive. As sort of a headline fact, but I guess it's when you dig into that and then how you kind of, it manifests itself, how you sort of manage, how you interact with the legislation, and then how you interpret that in respect of your organisation to get the best possible outcome. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you can get conflicts in terms of legislation, so it can prove quite challenging for sort of privacy and governance professionals to make those decisions in terms of what fits best. Because if an organisation's operating in multiple countries, they're going to have multiple different regimes they need to comply with, and multiple different regulators they need to interact.
Sure. That's a good answer. It's a really good point, that, Adam, and it kind of gets me thinking, because I don't know data privacy as much as I'd like, or maybe I should, to be fair. I'm not obsessed with the security side. And one thing I definitely pick up from the sort of seasoned CISOs and the people who are very, very mature when it comes to security is that frameworks are not just, yeah, they're good. It's like, yeah, they're a given. In fact, we're beyond frameworks. It's very much, frameworks are a start for 10. It's the departure lounge at the airport. And I suppose I've never had the chance to ask it. So, well, is that the same with privacy? Is it a case of, do people think, oh, if only I'm GDPR, then I'm finished, I'm done, I've arrived? Or is it a case of actually, no, GDPR, be compliant with that, but they're in the same way security, a lot of other things that you need to think about outside frameworks?
So I think with the UK GDPR, the principles is kind of, I guess, the lifeblood in terms of the compliance. That's the utopia in terms of what you're trying to achieve. I think probably the nuance is where how that differs between different organizations. What does that look like? What risks present themselves? If you look across sort of the sectors of work, the challenges in, say, a local government organization compared to a financial institution, compared to the construction industry, compared to media, they all present different challenges and different risks. And I think the one thing probably at the forefront of everyone's mind is, as with anything, you can't boil the ocean. So, I always think about it as sort of if you're defending a castle and you have to station your soldiers in different parts of the castle, you've got to really pinpoint what the high risks are, what poses the most detriment. Keep at the forefront of your mind that, the rights and freedoms of individuals, what protections they'd expect and anticipate, and then resource it appropriately. And I think subject to the different sectors, there's a big differentiation between how they'll be resourced. Or I think sort of early in my career where I've had maybe indirect resource or standalone roles, to latterly where I guess in financial services, because it's dual regulated through the FCA, is a lot more focus and emphasis. So my role's a lot more strategic now. I mean, my last two positions I've had teams of people. So I guess it's not only me thinking about the risk, it's about training those individuals to go out and be the advocate from a data privacy perspective and allowing those functions to perform effectively.
So with, I think given we've been talking about some of the regulation side and with DORA coming along, obviously the data privacy and protection aspect is super focused on confidentiality, safe handling of data, make sure data you're holding, you're meant to keep safe, isn't going to go AWOL and end up in the wrong hands. How much, and this is something we're very sort of interested in at Dress Tech, how much does sort of resilience for the business come into decision making? And you're coming into a business, you're working hand in glove with the CISO. How much is the resilience piece a factor, or would you say it's very secondary to the sort of confidentiality and safe handling aspect?
Well, I think the more resilient and robust an organization, the less risk posed to personal information. Because if they're appropriately set up to defend an attack, then there's less kind of management and mitigation in the aftermath. Prevention is undoubtedly better than cure. So I think I will naturally, take an interest in what the sort of information security function is doing, what risks are being thrown up. Do I need to get behind and become an advocate of any risks or platforms or protections that can be enhanced because it undoubtedly benefits my function? And I think that will pivot probably based on what the threat landscape looks like. Essentially, it's a balance of kind of horizon scanning to look at the risks and then appropriately setting your stall out to mitigate those risks.
That makes sense. And when you say protections, because I think of that as sort of much further down the tracks to the data privacy and data protection function. Do you work quite closely with SOC types, with sort of how often are you involved in sort of the output from say a pen test or a red team where perhaps they've been able to touch something that they really shouldn't have been able to?
Yeah, so I think what would usually happen, is probably the CISO will be the first port of call in terms of reviewing what's taken place, and then would sort of flag any risk directly to me or through our sort of committees and governance mechanisms, and then I will kind of challenge and scrutinize based on the output of those results. And equally, you know, sometimes I might read something in the news, I might hear something from another contact, and then I might go and outwardly kind of probe and say, look, you know, I'm aware this is kind of an emerging risk and an emerging threat. What does that mean for our organization? You know, are we set up, you know, to adequately protect against, you know, what's been sort of reported in the media or what we've been presented with?
Interesting. So, sorry, then I'm going to go fully off piece here.
I'll come in after you.
So I think something that a lot of people are aware of at the moment is the security situation in Europe at the moment, changing geopolitics. We're going a little bit off the rails here, but it'd be really interesting to get your take on it. I'm sure that's something that at a big company you're mindful of, and you've got planning and thoughts around changing situation, escalating conflicts, increasing instability. Be really interesting to hear the geopolitical take.
Yeah, so I think undoubtedly, you know, with the recent attacks reported in the media, you know, there's definitely, you know, an increased threat to organizations from cyber attacks. And I guess probably what has maybe been interesting to, you know, the general public is how crippling they can be to organizations. Because I think often you can hear about these things taking place, but you don't necessarily see the impact from
You don't see the blast
the
radius.
center. So I think you never like to see organizations fall down and be penetrated, because I think working in the industry we do, you know, naturally have a level of empathy in terms of the challenges that DPOs face, that CISOs faced in terms of to making sure organizations are adequately protected. I think equally you have to use those kind of situations as an opportunity for learning. And as I was speaking to previously, use that as an opportunity to really challenge and probe, you know, dig down into detail as to what the gaps were, and think about how you can line your ducks in a row most effectively. You know, I've always been a key sort of champion of effective communication, and I think sometimes when I've spoken to people about it, they've not always understood why it's key in terms of my day-to-day work. But with the events you've seen previously, what you tell customers, what you tell regulators, you know, it needs to line up in the right way. There needs to be consistent messaging, because that really speaks to your internal governance mechanisms that, you know, organizations will be attacked, they will be penetrated. How you subsequently manage and mitigate that issue and deal with it says a lot about you as an organization. You know, what are you like in a crisis? Are your incident management processes robust? What's your business continuity plans like? And how quickly you can get things back up and running again and address the issue in hand, you know, says a lot about you as an organization.
I think what I'd like to say, I'll steer it away from the geopolitical slightly now, but still keep it global. Though. I mean, me and Adam, where we're focused and where we spend most of our time is quite simply enterprise, and you know, we speak to very, very large organisations, global organisations, and as people who come to see on the podcast, we're chatting to folk all around. But that don't, even though that's where we're positioned, I remember where I kind of come from. One of the things that kind of concerns me more than anything in the security world is those lower down. I like to think of it like the maturity curve, and those lower down the curve, those people that have inherited security as their job role, those people that people look to in the organization when they see the big attacks on the news and they're looking for answers from those people. And I think it's difficult when they don't have the budget necessarily, they certainly don't have the resource. And then on the heartening side, from the people we speak to, they're more than happy to share their knowledge, the wise experience they've gained over years, and they want to help those low down that curve. And I suppose where I'm seeing this coming to the privacy side of things is, you know, I'm guessing you feel same. You're like top of the game, as it were, in terms of privacy. You know, what advice would you give to those those companies where it's as important to them as it is to a bank in every respect if they were to fall foul of regulation. But the reality of life is they don't have the budget, they don't have necessarily the experience and the knowledge, and they don't have the resource. I'd always start with people like that in security, saying, let's do an aggregated gap analysis. If you need some help, we can find someone to help you. If you can do it yourself, great. But start by finding out where you are. What would you say to people similarly on a privacy viewpoint, if that makes sense?
So I think for me, it's about being bold and confident in your decision making and being decisive to set a clear direction, but not always thinking you're right or you have all the answers. So for me, I know you appreciate the compliment being sort of top of my game now in terms of the length of time I've spent in industry. I see it as a great opportunity to kind of pay it forward because I was very lucky early in my career to be able to rely on the support of networks that I had built and have built and continue to build today. So when I came out of the ICO and have been surrounded by data privacy and professionals where data privacy compliance is front and center to their mind, it's very different when you go into an organization and you're kind of the figurehead and you might be standalone, you might have a small team and you're having to interact with different business areas and have often conflicting priorities. And it's about how I think you clearly articulate what the risks are, you give context in terms of what is required, but you're also understanding and respectful of the wider needs of the business as well to reach that collective outcome. So I think learn as much as you can, attend different events, build your network, get to know people, because people you can kind of pick up the phone to, get a second opinion on things, they're invaluable. And I think just be willing and brave to put your hand up and take ownership of things and be a figurehead, but don't run before you can walk. You've got to find the balance, and I guess be humble as well. You won't always get things right. If you make mistakes or you make the wrong judgment call, learn from it and think how you can grow from that experience. And I think, I guess, just finally listen to people. Like, often, I've sat in meetings in years gone by where someone will raise a question or a challenge and they will be, I guess, labeled or positioned as a disruptor or, causing problems. But I've always said if someone's raising something, there's probably 3 or 4 other people in the room who are raising that challenge. So rather than just put it to one side, actually probe into that challenge and understand it a bit better and address it. And I think you will gain confidence and credibility and often learn something by not only listening to that challenge, but addressing it, because whether or not it is a problem, it's a problem in the person you're interacting with, their mind. And like I say, a few people are probably thinking it. So if you address it, then you increase your credibility because you're not shying away from the challenges that are being posed to you.
Quality advice. I feel like we should probably put that on t-shirts or mugs, the whole build relationships, talk to people, be humble, listen, and you won't go too far wrong.
I think just really to wrap things up again, I'm going to build 2 questions into one from you. What's the worst bit of privacy advice you've ever seen out there and why? But then just turn on a positive, what's the best piece as well?
So I think the worst bit, and it's probably more general, but I remember someone saying to me very early in my career that you're not ready for this, you're not experienced enough, you need X amount of years to be able to operate at a particular level. And I think if I'd done that, then I wouldn't be where I am in my career today. Now, that's not to say as a result of that, I've took myself out of my comfort zone. I felt, at times, you can feel, oh, are you out of your depth? How do you handle this? How do you get up to speed quickly? But I think you need to back yourself as an individual. I always think, I used it recently, I think Jude Bellingham's a great example. a young footballer, but trusted with a great deal of responsibility because he's talented and gifted. So I think give people the opportunities because they will learn through experience. They just need, the appropriate level of oversight and support. And I guess as on the flip side, probably the best bit of advice is I remember someone said in a conference, like, leaders, they stand at the edge. They constantly stand at the edge. And it's about being comfortable in that environment. So, the people you lead, the people you sit in front of, it's not a case of you're any less nervous than them or any less scared. It's about standing at the front and being clear in direction and have confidence in your decision making and trusting that even if you have to figure some things out as you move along that process, you will get there in the end. I like the quote, which is, courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. The fear exists, but how you master and get comfortable with it is how you perform effectively as an individual.
I'm having that on my t-shirt because I
was going to say, Matt's dropping all these amazing lines.
I know, fantastic. Ads, have you got any final points you'd like to make before I wrap up?
No, I'm just marveling from all the knowledge bombs being dropped.
I must say, me too. And I guess from a privacy viewpoint, it is one of them worlds where, because I don't know it as, obviously I get the bits that fall squarely into security, but the bits that are a bit outside, and the fact that I did sit through the GDPR presentation my old company did 4 times in 2 days, and I found it quite intense. I didn't really know what to expect from today's cast. That's the honest truth. And I've got a lot more than what I thought. I thought it'd be good, but I've got a lot more. I think you offer a lot of advice, not just around security, Matthew, but about really how to interact with people and teams. And it's been really useful. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. I've really enjoyed the cast. And it goes without saying, you will be welcome back, sir. And I think we mentioned earlier, as people will see, we're doing slightly more panel-based talks going forward. What'll be really interesting will be to have you on some of them when we are talking about security things and you've got a privacy thing you want to sort of join in. As you say, the worlds, the crossover, the collide. What we'd like to offer is, if people would like to reach out to you, are you happy for people to maybe look to connect on LinkedIn, that kind of thing? Is that a preferred method for you?
Yeah, like I get lots of requests all the time, and I'm happy for people to connect. I will always try and respond as bandwidth permits. Those, good opportunity to build networks, and see it as a very two-way thing, that whilst people may want to learn something from me or ask me a question, I may learn something from them as well. So yeah, that's fine.
Thank you for joining us on the security tips, and we'll see you on future editions, sir.